Hello again, guys. Today is time to create the last review of the Jehammed's Will trilogy, meaning that today I will be reviewing the Black Atlantic, the third sourcebook adventure for the Degenesis role-playing game, and as I said, this is the third and last part. So today we'll be looking into all the greatness and also the flaws of this sourcebook, which is basically the finale of this epic adventure. So let's look at the basic things first. This is quite a big book, so the size of the Degenesis books has been growing steadily, starting from the first Untitled Blood, which was larger, about 100 pages, then doubling in the Killing Game, and now in the Black Atlantic we are at 275 some pages. The book is very sturdy, hardcover material, quite nice to hold and to look at, and begins with the exact same way as the other books, with a map of northwestern coast of Franca in this case, and gives you an overview of Briton and surrounding areas. So not only is Briton covered here, but also Briton itself, the domain of Argyll, the Marauder, then we have parts of northwestern Franca, importantly maybe the Gauntlet and the Forest of Druids, to mention some places, and then beginning with the Protectorate on the Francan side. The book is divided into different chapters in the same way as the earlier books. So we have kind of an introduction with description of these different locations. In the first chapter, titled Starfire, second chapter, Burnt Idols, goes into the different characters, different NPCs in this area, and also in the adventure of the Black Atlantic, and third and fourth chapters are the adventure Black Atlantic. In the end of the book you also have a map of the city of Brest, which forms the main location for the adventure. This continues the, let's say, Degenesis style of having a largely city centric adventures, but here in the Black Atlantic, unfortunately, the characters are also going out of the city to experience things at sea in different locations. So this is a bit of a departure from the Killing Game, which really was focused in the city of Toulon. The prologue and first chapter give you the basics of northwestern Franca and of Britain and the history of Britain and the main events which have shaped it to be the way it's in the beginning of the adventure. So Britain has successfully resisted the advance of the Ferromancers, and an Anabaptist named Vicarant beheaded the Ferromancer Ganares in a battle some years ago, and has established the Anabaptist domination of the area. His stepfather, King Oppolus, basically rules the Briton clan, and the Anabaptists have important locations in Mont Saint-Michel and Rennes, where different leaders are governing their cults. The other interesting cults in the area are the Scrappers, who have a central location in Saint Brieuc, but also are very much present in Brest, especially in one of the NPCs, which we will see later. And they have a covered operation on the Atlantic Sea, drilling oil for the chroniclers. And this also is one of the interesting backstories of the book. Then Briton is covered also in this beginning chapters briefly. It is the domain of Argai, the Marauder, who is using his slave warriors, the Pictons, to govern the area, and is performing raids into Europe, and the Pictons also will play a role in the adventure. And related to this is also the Sleeper Prophet Helios, who has been Argai's captive in Britain. But let's say Britain itself is an area which is currently enjoying from a period of peace after these Fairmancer incursions, so the situation there is not completely similar, for example, to Southern Franca or Toulon, where the Fairmancers are really dominating the area and threatening human existence. The first chapter gives you a very good overview of the different locations. Some of the smaller locations, smaller cities, are described quite briefly, but it again has really nice looking art in beautiful 2-page spreads, and gives you enough information to bring your players to these locations and think of different adventures which are possible there. One of the more intriguing locations is the Forest of the Druids, where the so-called Druids are following an AmSumo robot who has taken the responsibility of caring for the local clanners. Major cities, major locations like Rennes and Brest have a bit more information about them, and the different cults located in them are covered in a bit more detail, and there is the familiar fact sheet about these different cities, giving the population structure, tech level, governing force, the type of city guard, how much artifact trade they are involved in, and what types of communications are possible. So very good background information when you are running an adventure in one of these locations. So basically Saint-Brieuc, Rennes and Aquitaine are covered in more detail, and then a lot of information is given on the city of Brest, which really is the main focus in the adventure and in the book itself. Brest is the domain of King Oppolus of the Brittonic clan, and this is a bit of a low-tech location compared with for example Toulon or even Justinian, which now is coming out as the really highest tech in some of the locations in Justinian. But Brest is decidedly a lot more low-tech, with a lot of the business focusing on things like walrus hunting and fishing, and there is also a very large presence of the Anabaptist cult here. So I would say in general the first chapter gives you a very good overview of the area and the different locations, and especially the city of Brest, and it gives you a lot of background history on Britain and on this area, so that you could use it not only to run the adventure but also to plot different adventures which could take place in northwestern Franca. One of the good parts here is again the rumor mill, which gives players a different number of rumors to look into, and they really give them kind of a first impression of what type of things are happening underneath the kind of stable and civilized city of Brest, and what is really happening with different factions which are operating there. There is a very detailed timeline, and that basically finishes the first chapter. The second chapter goes into the descriptions of the different NPCs, the most important ones being now the red pack of Spitalian preservists who are operating in northwestern Franca, and this ties into the Rising Ravens adventure where the players had the possibility of saving one of their members who is here making a comeback in a really different situation, and I think also with a different position considering the players and their motivations. So we have in the beginning a description of Pascal, the leader of the Red Pack, and Dr. Vega, who is really the mind behind Red Pack's activities, those Spitalians. And then this goes on to describe different characters, chroniclers, local Brittany, a Gannerid, scrappers, Jehammedans, Anabaptists, and all the different characters who make up the adventure of the Black Atlantic. Once again, SIXMOREVODKA has changed a bit the way of showing the artwork. So here we have these full page images, now focusing really on the faces of these different characters, and on the other page we have the full stats and description and role-playing information about the character. So they have changed this a bit from the earlier publications, and this is clearly evolving, as in Justitian we have these full figures of the characters themselves. But the art here is really beautiful, the portraits are really nice, and it's always interesting to see the players' reactions to these portraits as they see the faces of their allies and enemies. The descriptions of these different NPCs are really on a very detailed level, as has been the custom, so all the similar information as before is included here. The full stats, their specific potentials, which they might be using, their equipment, their possessions, and any special information, it's all included here. Then the third part begins the adventure of the Black Atlantic itself, and this adventure is really following in the format of the earlier adventures in the Jehammed's Will trilogy, meaning it's really tightly scripted. There are of course a number of optional scenes that you can use or discard, but in order to get the best of the adventure, it would make sense to follow it quite tightly. Of course, a lot of people are adapting it in their own ways, and I also saw that it makes sense to make small changes as the players are making the adventure their own and are running through the different events. But if you're not a fan of really tightly scripted, tightly planned adventures where you don't have a lot of say in how it will end or how you want to order the events, then I suggest that you really restructure the adventure to your own fashion. I do think that the adventure runs quite nicely and smoothly in the way that it's been written, but there are some cases where you might want to discard some events or add something more to flesh it out even further. To discuss and fully go through the adventure Black Atlantic, I think there are some really flaws in the adventure which have to be addressed here in this review. But if you look at the beginning of the adventure, it starts out with a encounter with a monster and the Spitalians, and then goes on to show you the different goings on in the city of Brest, and introduces a number of different characters quite quickly with really a kind of a tight rhythm. So the good guys and the bad guys are established quite well and quite early in the adventure. The adventure itself does not begin with a lot of combat. There are some occasions where the players have to resort to violence to protect themselves or protect different NPCs, but here the adventure is more of a detective work and social encounters between different people. There is one case in the beginning where there is a possibility that you might lose a player with a bad roll, which is not so nice to see. So there are big explosions happening, and the lives of some players might hang on a successful roll. The adventure ties really multiple different plots together, so you are not only trying to find out what is causing the monstrous creatures which are rising from the Atlantic Ocean, but you are also involved in the power struggle between the Anabaptists, the Spitalians, and the Briton locals, and you are witnessing the kind of emergence of the Marauders here in the form of Argar and his Briton slave warriors, and then with Ifrit, who represents Arius. I'm not gonna detail all the plot here, but I will talk about certain points in the book. The adventure itself does focus on some bits of nudity, and I think it's worth mentioning to the people who are not comfortable with that, and especially you might be running the game with different types of players, some who are more or less let's say okay with that, so your mileage may vary on how much you want to present nudity. The Degenesis game itself is intended for people over 16 years of age, so it should not be a problem, but I think it's important to state that the Black Atlantic book does not include any type of warnings about the amount of nudity or sex-related scenes. And there we come to one of the major issues in the book, which is basically a scene where an NPC is having intercourse with a player. Some people stated that straight out raping the player in an optional scene, and I think this may be one of the flaws in the writing of the adventure. The scene itself is not really a central to the adventure. It does give maybe some background and establish some mood or theme of certain things, but I felt that it was really kind of a superficial attempt to be a bit more edgy and adult in this adventure than was really needed. I have run into lots of comments online about this adventure and this scene, and how it's basically violating a lot of player agency and should not be included, and I feel that this may be the central flaw in this adventure. When I ran the adventure, I did not include the scene at all, and there were also a couple of related scenes which have been following this kind of theme of haunting that I discarded. Of course, you could include those, but I did not feel that they were super central to the story. The adventure takes place largely in Brest, but then diverges to the island of Ushant, and later on to a place called Morlex, where there are different events taking place, and I felt that the adventure has a really nice pace, although it does introduce lots of NPCs with a really in a really short time frame, and there's lots of plot points to follow. The players commented that there were lots of surprises which really took them unawares, and it was nice to see how they reacted to the different events which took place. There's nice plotting and really great surprises and conflicts built in the adventure, and I think it does really nicely continue the Jehammed's World trilogy and has an interesting finale. So I think the major good points about the adventure itself are that it is really immersive, has an interesting plot, lots of different NPCs to get to know and to interact with. The Marauders are here given a lot more screen time and introduced a bit more fully into the world of Degenesis, as they were not done before, and you have a different view into the developing world of Degenesis. The flaws in the adventure, I would say, are the mouth railroading and tight scripting. Here I think also the way of scripting and writing has evolved considerably from In Thy Blood, so it's a bit easier to follow and to enjoy the way that the plot has been scripted, and the main flaw being this rape scene and sexual content, which I think has not been handled very well. But if you disregard these parts, then I think you can have a really great and enjoyable adventure in the Black Atlantic. Considering the finale and the ending of the Black Atlantic, I think it gives you a partial ending, but this is not, as you can see in many Degenesis products, this is not the final ending or the final word on how things stand. So you are left in a situation where you have resolved a number of plots, number of points, but then you are expected to carry on and continue in Justitian and in the future events. So the book again finishes with a description of events following the Black Atlantic, and goes on to describe what happens to the area and also what happens with different characters as Black Atlantic finishes, and what are possibilities for continuing the adventure. And we will see some of them making a return in the Justitian sourcebook and continuing in the future. So the final part of the book is also really nice and really important if you wish to continue the adventures here in this location. So to sum up my review, I would say that the Black Atlantic is a great sourcebook, a good adventure, but with some flaws which might really turn off some people. But it's perfectly playable. You can adapt it to your own use. You can make whatever you want out of it and use it as part of your Degenesis world. I think it's like the other Degenesis products, it's really worth looking into, if only for the sake of admiring its beautiful pictures, the great looking layout and imagery, and looking into the ideas that have really been poured into this book, just as in the books which came before it. And the fullest value you can get is by playing through the adventure and putting your players in Briton and in the world of Degenesis. The PDF of this book is available for free at the best possible price at the Degenesis.com website, and the physical book can be ordered there on the website as well. So I would recommend really checking out this book and the other Degenesis books there and getting to know the world of Degenesis. So that's the end of my review. I hope you liked it, and if you did, give it a thumbs up and subscribe and follow the channel for more news about role-playing games, more reviews and different types of content. Thank you.